I didn't mean for it to happen, Susan. You have to believe me. Pastor David's voice cracked as he clutched his coffee mug, knuckles white against the ceramic. His eyes, usually so calm and reassuring during Sunday sermons, now darted frantically around my kitchen, landing everywhere but on me. I stood frozen by the sink, dish towel hanging limp in my hand. The words I'd just heard seemed to echo in the small space between us, bouncing off the yellow walls my husband Tom had promised to repaint for 3 years now. What exactly are you saying happened, David? My voice sounded strange to my own ears, too controlled, too quiet. Inside, I felt like I was screaming. He finally looked at me, those kind eyes now filled with a mixture of guilt and something else I couldn't quite place. Emma and we'd been meeting to talk, at first. She was having such a hard time with Tom's behavior, and you were shutting everyone out. I was worried about both of you. Emma. My best friend since I moved to Millfield. The woman who had held my hand through 3 miscarriages and brought casseroles when I was too exhausted from hospital shifts to cook. Emma, who knew exactly what happened behind my closed doors when Tom had been drinking. And then? I prompted, still in that eerily calm voice. And then, it became more. He set the mug down with a thud, coffee sloshing over the rim onto my meticulously clean countertop. Susan, I prayed about this. I've asked for guidance. What we did, was wrong. But I think God brought us together for a reason. The laugh that escaped me sounded more like a sob. God? You think God wanted you to sleep with my best friend while counseling my abusive husband? That's not what Get out. I pointed to the door, the dish towel still clutched in my other hand like some ridiculous weapon. Get out of my house. Susan, please. Now. The scream tore from my throat, surprising us both. In 15 years of marriage to Tom, I'd learned that raising your voice only made things worse. I'd become an expert at swallowing my anger, my pain, my everything. But in that moment, as Pastor David, the man our entire community revered, the man who had been counseling Tom about his anger issues for the past 6 months, gathered his coat and Bible, something broke loose inside me. I was 55 years old. I had spent my entire adult life caring for others, first as a nurse at Millfield General, then as Tom's wife, his punching bag, his secret shame. I was tired. So damn tired. As the door closed behind David, I sank to the kitchen floor, my back against the cabinets, and did something I hadn't allowed myself to do in years. I cried. It had started like most love stories do, with a chance meeting and that peculiar flutter in the chest that romance novels are so fond of describing. I was 27, fresh out of my nursing program and working the ER night shift at Millfield General. Tom came in with a construction injury, a nasty gash on his forearm that required 12 stitches. He was charming, rugged, with laugh lines around his eyes that deepened when he smiled through the pain. You got a gentle touch, he'd said as I cleaned his wound. Most nurses just jab you and move on. That's because most nurses have 50 patients waiting. You're lucky it's a slow night. He'd laughed then, a warm sound that seemed to fill the small curtained-off area. Lucky's my middle name. Thomas Lucky Reynolds. I'd smiled despite myself. Is that so, Mr. Reynolds? Call me Tom. And you are? He squinted at my name tag, Susan. Susan what? Susan Martinez. Pretty name for a pretty lady. It was a line, obviously. But the way he said it, with that small-town sincerity that seemed miles away from the slick guys I'd dated in nursing school, made me blush anyway. He asked me out before the doctor had even finished his stitches. I said yes before I had time to think about it. 6 months later, we were married in the small white church where his family had attended for generations. I converted to his faith, partly out of love and partly because it seemed important to him. My own Catholic upbringing had been more cultural than spiritual, My parents' attendance at Mass more habit than devotion. The first 2 years were good. Not perfect, no marriages, but good. Tom worked hard, came home tired but affectionate. We talked about children, about buying a house instead of renting the small apartment above Mrs. Gallagher's garage. The first time he hit me, it was so unexpected I couldn't process it. We'd been arguing about something trivial, the electric bill, I think. I'd suggested he could take shorter showers to save money, and his face had changed. Just changed. Like someone else had stepped into his body. His open palm connected with my cheek before I could even register the shift. The force knocked me against the refrigerator, magnets scattering to the floor like startled insects. There was a moment of terrible silence afterward. I touched my face, feeling the heat rising to the surface. Tom looked at his hand as if it belonged to someone else. "Susie," he whispered, "I didn't. I would never." And then he was crying, big heaving sobs that shook his broad shoulders. Crying and apologizing and promising it would never happen again. Telling me about his father, about growing up watching his mother cover bruises with makeup and long sleeves. "I swore I'd never be like him," Tom said, his face buried in my lap as he knelt on our kitchen floor. "I swore it, Susie. Please forgive me. Please don't leave." I forgave him. And when it happened again 3 months later, I forgave him again. And again. And again, until forgiveness became as routine as brushing my teeth or checking the mail. I became an expert at explaining away bruises and fractures. Clumsy me, walked into a door. Fell down the porch steps, can you believe it? My fellow nurses exchanged glances but said nothing. In a small town like Millfield, people minded their business. Besides, Tom Reynolds was well liked, coaching Little League, volunteering at church functions, always ready to help a neighbor fix a leaky roof or jumpstart a car. Who would believe that such a good man could do such terrible things? The sound of a car in the driveway pulled me from my memories. I scrambled up from the kitchen floor, quickly splashing cold water on my face. Tom couldn't find me like this, red-eyed, vulnerable. That never ended well. But it wasn't Tom's pickup truck I heard. It was Emma's sensible blue sedan. My heart rate doubled. What was she doing here? Did she know that Pastor David had confessed? Was she coming to explain, to apologize, to justify? I watched through the window as she sat in her car, hands gripping the steering wheel, clearly gathering courage. The midday sun caught on her auburn hair, still vibrant despite the gray that had begun to creep in at her temples. We had joked once about growing old together, two wrinkled ladies causing trouble in the nursing home. The thought made fresh tears spring to my eyes. I blinked them back fiercely and squared my shoulders. No more crying. No more weakness. Emma's soft knock came a moment later. I considered not answering, but in a town like Millfield, that would only invite more attention. People would notice. They would talk. And eventually, Tom would hear. So I opened the door but blocked the entrance with my body. "Emma." Her eyes widened at my tone, flat, emotionless. Not the Susan she knew, who always greeted her with a hug and often a fresh-baked something from the oven. "Susie," she said, her voice small. "Can I come in? I need to explain." "I think Pastor David explained enough." She flinched as if I'd slapped her. Good. Let her feel a fraction of the pain lancing through my chest. "Please," she whispered. "Not out here. Mrs. Harmon across the street has already noticed us." I glanced over her shoulder and sure enough, Martha Harmon was pretending to check her mailbox while obviously watching us with keen interest. Martha, whose son had been in Tom's Little League team. Martha, who brought us a lasagna when I had that accident and broke my wrist 2 winters ago. Wordlessly, I stepped aside to let Emma in. She walked past me into the living room, her familiar perfume, something floral and light, wafting in her wake. How many times had she sat on my couch, drinking tea and listening as I carefully edited my marital troubles? Sharing enough to explain the occasional visible bruise but never the full truth. Never telling her about the times Tom had held me down, or thrown me against walls, or threatened much worse if I ever tried to leave him. Had she known anyway? Had she pitied me while falling in love with the man supposedly helping us? I know what you must be thinking, Emma began, perching on the edge of the sofa as if afraid to make herself comfortable. I doubt that very much. I remained standing, arms crossed over my chest. Susie, it wasn't planned. We never meant to hurt you. Her eyes filled with tears. David and I, it just happened. We were both so worried about you, spending all this time talking about your situation with Tom, and what? You bonded over my misery? Fell in love while discussing my latest bruises? The bitterness in my voice surprised even me. That's not fair, she whispered. Fair? You want to talk to me about fair? My laugh was harsh in the quiet room. Was it fair when you let me cry on your shoulder after Tom dislocated my shoulder last Christmas, knowing you were sleeping with the man who was supposed to be helping him? Emma blanched. I didn't know about the shoulder. You told me you fell on the ice. Of course you didn't know. Nobody knows. That's how this works, Emma. I lie, everyone pretends to believe me, and life goes on. I was shaking now, years of carefully contained rage threatening to spill over. Meanwhile, you and Pastor David found comfort in each other's arms. How convenient. It wasn't like that, she protested, tears streaming down her face now. We care about you. Both of us. So much. That's why David's been counseling Tom, trying to get him to see what he's doing to you. And how's that working out? I gestured around the immaculate living room, where nothing was ever out of place because Tom couldn't stand disorder. Where the walls had been patched and repainted more times than I could count to cover holes made by fists or thrown objects. He came home last night and broke a plate because dinner was cold. Threatened to break my fingers next time. Really effective counseling there. Emma's face crumpled. Oh, Susie. Why didn't you tell me it was still happening? The absurdity of her question, after everything, made me laugh again, that same strange, broken sound. Why would I tell you anything now, Emma? You betrayed me. Both of you. I know. She buried her face in her hands. I know, and I'm so sorry. But please, you have to understand. The sound of tires on gravel silenced us both. Tom's truck. Home early. My heart leapt into my throat, a Pavlovian response after years of walking on eggshells. You need to go. I was already moving toward Emma, pulling her up by the arm. Now. Out the back. But we need to talk. Not now. I propelled her toward the kitchen and the back door beyond. I can't have him find you here. Not today. Understanding dawned in her eyes, not just about the immediate danger, but a deeper realization about my life. About what it was really like to be Susan Reynolds. As I practically shoved her out the back door, she turned to me. Come with me, Susie. Right now. You don't have to stay here. For a split second, I was tempted. So tempted. But then I heard Tom's key in the front door. Go, I hissed, shutting the door in her face and racing back to the living room, arranging myself on the couch with a magazine just as Tom walked in. Hey, babe, he called, the normalcy of his greeting at odds with the tension I could already sense underneath. Something had gone wrong at work. I could tell by the tight set of his shoulders, the way his eyes darted around the room looking for something, anything out of place. Hi, honey. I kept my voice light, neutral. You're home early. Got rained out. He hung up his jacket with precise movements. Too precise. Who were you talking to? My pulse quickened. Talking to? I heard voices when I pulled up. He moved into the living room, looming over me. You know I don't like surprises, Susie. I was on the phone, I lied smoothly, holding up my cell phone as evidence. With Dr. Patel's office. About that prescription. He studied my face, looking for tells. I'd gotten good at hiding them over the years. Finally, he nodded, seemingly satisfied. Fix me a drink, would you? It's been a hell of a day. I rose automatically, the good wife performing her duties. As I passed him on my way to the kitchen, he caught my wrist, his fingers digging in just enough to hurt without leaving marks. You'd tell me if someone was here, right, Susie? No secrets between us. I met his gaze steadily. No secrets, Tom. He released me with a pat on the cheek that was just a little too hard to be affectionate. That's my girl. In the kitchen, I fixed his whiskey with hands that barely trembled. Through the window, I could see Emma's car still parked down the street, just out of view from our driveway. Waiting. Hoping I would change my mind and run to her. But where would I go? What would I do? At 55, after nearly 3 decades of marriage, who would I even be without Tom Reynolds defining my existence? As I carried his drink back to the living room, I realized I wasn't sure I wanted to find out. 2 days passed in a fog of normalcy that felt more suffocating than usual. I went to work at the seniors' clinic where I'd been employed since retiring from hospital shifts 5 years ago. I came home. I cooked dinner. I avoided Tom's triggers as best I could. He seemed preoccupied, working late and bringing home paperwork from the construction company where he'd been promoted to foreman last year. A blessing, really. The less attention he paid to me, the safer I was. I hadn't heard from Emma or Pastor David, though I'd called in sick to church on Sunday, unable to face either of them or the congregation that would surely be watching for signs of the drama unfolding in our small community. On Wednesday afternoon, an unfamiliar face appeared at the clinic, a woman in her 40s with close-cropped salt and pepper hair and intelligent eyes behind simple wire-rimmed glasses. I'm looking for Susan Reynolds, she said to our receptionist, who pointed toward my desk. Can I help you? I asked as she approached, automatically assessing her as I would a patient. Healthy, fit, carrying herself with the confidence of someone comfortable in her own skin. Mrs. Reynolds. My name is R.A. Chell Cohen. I'm a chaplain at Millfield General. She held out her hand, grip firm when I shook it. I was hoping we could talk for a few minutes. My guard went up immediately. About? Her smile was kind but not patronizing. About some concerns that have been brought to my attention. Is there somewhere private we could speak? My first instinct was to refuse, to send her away. But something in her demeanor, direct, professional, but with an underlying gentleness, made me reconsider. I'm due for my lunch break. We could walk to the park across the street. 10 minutes later, we sat on a bench watching ducks paddle across the small pond. Rachel had bought us both coffees from the cart near the entrance, waving away my attempt to pay her back. So, I said after an awkward silence. Who sent you? Emma or David? Rachel's eyebrows rose slightly. Neither, actually. I received a call from Dr. Patel at the hospital. She's been concerned about you for some time. Dr. Patel. The ER doctor who had treated me multiple times over the years. Who had given me her card with a domestic violence hotline number written on the back. Who had looked at me with knowing eyes the last time I'd come in with a kitchen accident that had required 17 stitches. I see. I stared into my coffee cup. And what exactly did Dr. Patel tell you? That she believes you're in an abusive relationship. That she's tried to help, but you've consistently refused resources. Rachel's voice remained gentle, matter of fact. She thought perhaps, as a chaplain rather than a doctor, I might be able to connect with you differently. I laughed softly. Because I go to church? Because spirituality can be both a prison and a pathway to freedom. She sipped her coffee. Sometimes people stay in dangerous situations because they believe it's what God wants. That suffering is their cross to bear. Her words hit uncomfortably close to home. How many times had Pastor David reminded our congregation about the sanctity of marriage? About forgiveness and second chances? I don't know what you think you know about my marriage, I began defensively. I know that you've been to the ER 8 times in the past decade with injuries consistent with abuse, Rachel cut in, still calm but with steel beneath her words. I know that your husband has a record of bar fights and disorderly conduct from his 20s. And I know that you deserve better, Susan. Much better. The directness of her approach left me momentarily speechless. No one in Millfield spoke this way, everything was hints and whispers and careful avoidance of uncomfortable truths. Even if what you're suggesting were true, I finally said, choosing my words carefully, I'm 55 years old. I've been married to Tom for almost 30 years. Where exactly would I go? What would I do? You'd be surprised how many women ask me that exact question. Rachel reached into her bag and pulled out a card. There are options, Susan. More than you might think. Places to stay, legal help, support groups, financial assistance. You wouldn't be alone. I took the card automatically but didn't look at it. My husband isn't just some random man in town. He's respected. Connected. His family has been here for generations. And you think that would protect him if people knew the truth? I think small towns have long memories and don't like outsiders telling them their business. I glanced pointedly at her, with her city clothes and direct manner. Rachel smiled slightly. I grew up 20 miles from here, Susan. My father was the rabbi in Westbrook until he retired last year. I'm hardly an outsider. That surprised me. There wasn't much religious diversity in this part of the state. Then you should understand how things work around here, I said. I understand that abuse thrives in silence, she countered. And that good people often enable bad behavior because confrontation is uncomfortable. We sat quietly for a moment, watching an elderly man throw bread crumbs to the ducks despite the sign clearly asking visitors not to feed them. Why are you doing this? I finally asked. You don't know me. My problems aren't your responsibility. Rachel's expression softened. 20 years ago, my sister was killed by her husband after 10 years of abuse. She tried to leave 6 times. The 7th time, she didn't make it out of the house. She paused, the pain of this confession evident despite the time that had passed. Since then, I've dedicated my life to making sure other women have the support she didn't. I didn't know what to say to that. My standard deflections and denials seemed hollow in the face of her personal tragedy. I'm not asking you to make any decisions right now, Rachel continued after a moment. Just keep my card. Think about what I've said. And know that when you're ready, if you're ever ready, there are people who will help you. She stood then, gathering her bag. I'm at the hospital most days, and my cell number is on the card. Day or night, Susan. I mean that. As she walked away, I finally looked down at the business card in my hand. Rachel Cohen, chaplain, it read, with her contact information. On the back, she'd written, "You are stronger than you know." Such a simple platitude. And yet, something about seeing those words written in her neat handwriting made my throat tighten unexpectedly. I slipped the card into my wallet, behind my driver's license where Tom would never look. Just in case. That night, Tom came home drunk. Not falling down drunk, but the dangerous kind, just enough alcohol to loosen his inhibitions while leaving his physical capabilities intact. I knew the signs immediately, the too careful way he moved, the slight slurring of certain words, the flush high on his cheekbones. My body tensed automatically, muscle memory from years of these episodes. Where's dinner? He demanded, looking around the kitchen where I'd been folding laundry and cooking. I didn't know when you'd be home, I said carefully. I can make something quick now. Or we could order pizza? Wrong answer. His face darkened. We're not wasting money on takeout because you couldn't be bothered to have a meal ready. What do you even do all day? I worked a 10-hour shift at the clinic, I reminded him, already moving toward the refrigerator, looking for something I could prepare quickly. Mrs. Abernathy had a bad reaction to her new medication, and we were short-staffed. Always an excuse. He followed me, crowding my space as I pulled out eggs and cheese. You think I don't work hard? You think I want to come home to an empty table after busting my ass all day? I'm sorry, I said automatically, the words a reflex at this point. I'll make an omelet. It'll just take a few minutes. He grabbed my wrist as I reached for a bowl, squeezing hard enough that I knew there would be marks tomorrow. Maybe I don't want an omelet. Did you think of that? The familiar fear rose in my throat, but alongside it, something else flickered, a strange detachment, as if I were watching the scene from outside my body. I saw myself cowering slightly, saw Tom's face twisted with a rage disproportionate to the situation. And for the first time in years, I wondered, what would happen if I didn't play my part? What do you want, then? I asked, my voice steadier than I expected. He blinked, thrown off script by my calm response. What? For dinner. What do you want instead of an omelet? His grip on my wrist tightened painfully. Don't get smart with me, Susan. I'm not. I'm asking a simple question. I met his gaze directly, something I rarely dared to do when he was in this mood. If you don't want eggs, tell me what you'd prefer. For a moment, confusion replaced anger in his expression, the confusion of a man whose control was being subtly challenged. Then his face contorted again. You know what? I'm not hungry anymore. He shoved my arm away, causing me to stumble back against the counter. I'm going out. Out where? The question slipped out before I could stop it. He whirled back toward me. Are you keeping tabs on me now? Is that what's happening? No, I just... The back of his hand connected with my cheek before I could finish, the force snapping my head to the side. Pain bloomed, bright and hot, as tears sprang to my eyes. Don't question me, he growled, looming over me. Ever. I should have apologized. Should have assured him I wouldn't do it again. That was the script, the one that had kept me relatively safe for decades. But Rachel's card was burning a hole in my wallet, and her words echoed in my mind, you are stronger than you know. Instead of cowering, I straightened, one hand pressed to my throbbing cheek. I think you should leave now, Tom. Surprise registered on his face, quickly replaced by dangerous fury. What did you just say to me? I said you should leave. My voice shook, but I kept going. Go see. Olaf somewhere. We can talk when you're sober. Time seemed to slow as I watched calculation cross his features. This was new territory for both of us. In all our years together, I had never directly challenged him during one of his rages. Who've you been talking to? He finally asked, his voice deadly quiet. Is it that pastor? Has he been filling your head with ideas? The irony of his accusation might have made me laugh under different circumstances. If only he knew what Pastor David had really been doing. No one, I lied. I'm just tired, Tom. So tired. Something in my tone must have reached him, because he took a step back, running a hand through his thinning hair. Fine. I'll go have a drink with the guys. But this conversation isn't over, Susan. Something's different with you lately, and I don't like it. He grabbed his keys from the counter and stalked out, the front door slamming behind him hard enough to rattle the windows. I heard his truck start, the engine revving angrily before he peeled out of the driveway. Only when the sound of his vehicle had faded completely did I allow myself to sink to the kitchen floor, body trembling with delayed shock and something that felt dangerously like hope. Before I could talk myself out of it, I pulled my phone from my pocket and Rachel's card from my wallet. My fingers shook as I dialed her number. She answered on the third ring. "This is Rachel." "It's Susan Reynolds," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "From earlier today." "Susan." Her tone warmed immediately. "I'm glad you called. I swallowed hard, forcing the words out. "I think I might need that help you mentioned. Sooner rather than later." There was no triumph in her voice. "No, I told you so." Just quiet efficiency. "Are you safe right now?" "He left. Went to the bar, probably." "Good. That gives us time. Do you have somewhere you can go tonight? A friend or family member he wouldn't think to look for you?" Emma's face flashed in my mind, but I pushed the thought away. Not her. Not after what had happened. "No," I admitted. "There's nowhere he wouldn't check eventually." "All right. I know a place, but I'd need to make a call." "Can you pack a bag quickly?" "Just essentials for a few days." The reality of what I was contemplating hit me suddenly. I was going to leave. After almost 30 years, I was actually going to walk out the door. "Susan?" Rachel prompted when I didn't respond. "Are you still there?" "Yes," I whispered. I've never done this before. The few times I tried, I never even made it past packing a bag." "It's scary," she acknowledged. "One of the scariest things you'll ever do. But you're not doing it alone this time." A pause, then, "Can I come get you? Would that make it easier?" Relief flooded through me at the offer. "Yes. Please. Text me your address. I'll be there in 20 minutes. And Susan? Bring any important documents you can find: birth certificate, social security card, insurance information, and any medications you need." After we hung up, I sat frozen for another moment, half expecting Tom to burst back through the door and catch me in the act of betrayal. When that didn't happen, I forced myself to move. Upstairs, I pulled a small duffel bag from the back of our closet and filled it methodically: clothes, toiletries, the framed photo of my parents from my bedside table, my nursing certification, the small jewelry box containing my mother's wedding ring, and the few pieces Tom had given me in better times. In the office, I located our fireproof box and extracted my birth certificate and social security card. I hesitated, then took our marriage certificate and the deed to the house as well. Evidence. Proof that I was who I said I was, that my claims were real. As I zipped the bag closed, my phone buzzed with a text. Rachel, saying she was 5 minutes away. I took one last look around the bedroom where I'd spent countless nights beside a man who claimed to love me even as he hurt me. Then I walked downstairs, wrote a brief note: "I'm safe. Don't look for me," and placed it on the kitchen table. Rachel's sensible sedan pulled up just as I stepped onto the porch, bag in hand. She got out immediately, coming around to take my duffel and place it in the back seat. "You're doing the right thing," she said quietly as she opened the passenger door for me. I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. As we drove away, I didn't look back at the house. I couldn't. If I did, 30 years of conditioning might override this moment of courage, and I'd ask her to turn around. Instead, I stared straight ahead, one hand lightly touching my bruised cheek, and took the first deep breath I'd managed in hours. Maybe in years. The safe place turned out to be a modest ranch-style house on the outskirts of Westbrook, the neighboring town where Rachel had grown up. A discreet sign by the door read Grace House, but otherwise, it looked like any other home on the quiet street. "It's a shelter?" I asked as we pulled into the driveway. "A transitional house," Rachel corrected. For women who need a safe place while they figure out next steps. It's run by an interfaith coalition. My father helped start it years ago. The door opened before we reached it, revealing a tall black woman with close-cropped gray hair and a welcoming smile. "Rachel," she greeted warmly, then turned her attention to me. "And you must be Susan. Come in, come in. You're safe here." Her name was Audrey, I learned as she showed me to a small but clean bedroom with its own attached bathroom. She had been running Grace House for 15 years, ever since retiring from her position as a high school principal. "This is your space for as long as you need it," she told me, placing fresh towels on the bed. "Meals are communal in the kitchen, but you can always bring food back to your room if you need privacy. The only house rule is that you attend one support group session each week. We have them here on Tuesdays and Thursdays." I nodded numbly, still not quite believing I had actually left. "Thank you. How many other women are here?" "Currently 3, plus you. Our capacity is 6, but we try to keep it at 4 or 5 to ensure everyone has adequate support." She patted my hand gently. "You'll meet them at breakfast if you feel up to it. No pressure if you don't." After Audrey left, Rachel lingered in the doorway. "Will you be okay tonight? I can stay for a while if you'd like company." I shook my head. "I think I need to be alone. To process." "I understand." She handed me a small business card. "This has the house phone number and address. There's also a panic button in each room. It alerts both the police and our security service." Seeing my expression, she added, "Just a precaution. No one who hasn't been cleared knows you're here." After she left, I sat on the edge of the bed, bag still packed at my feet. The silence enveloped me, not the tense, waiting silence of my house when Tom was in a mood, but a peaceful quiet. For the first time in decades, I didn't need to attune my ears for the sound of a car in the driveway, for footsteps that would tell me what kind of evening to expect. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt hollow. Empty. As if I'd left not just my house but some essential part of myself behind. I unpacked mechanically, hanging clothes in the small closet, arranging toiletries in the bathroom. When everything was in its place, I lay down on the unfamiliar bed and stared at the ceiling, wondering what Tom was doing. Had he found my note yet? Was he angry, or worse, was he worried? Hurt? Despite everything, the thought of causing him pain still bothered me. What kind of person did that make me? To still care about the feelings of a man who had spent years systematically destroying my sense of self? Sleep eluded me for hours as these thoughts chased each other through my mind. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were chaotic, Tom appearing at the door, Pastor David preaching about forgiveness while Emma sat in the front pew, Rachel standing silently at the back of the church, watching it all. I woke exhausted, disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. For a moment, panic gripped me. Where was I? What had I done? Before memory rushed back. I had left Tom. After 30 years of threats and violence and apologies and reconciliations, I had finally walked out the door. And I had no idea what came next. The first week at Grace House passed in a blur. I met the other residents, Jasmine, a young mother with twin toddlers who had fled an emotionally abusive boyfriend, Maria, in her 30s, whose husband's escalating control had culminated in him breaking her arm, and Diane, a woman close to my age who had left her husband of 40 years after decades of psychological abuse. "He never hit me," Diane confided during my first support group session. "Not once. But he destroyed me in other ways. Made me doubt my own mind, my own memories. Convinced me I was crazy, unstable. By the time I left, I couldn't even decide what to wear without panicking that I was making the wrong choice." The others nodded in understanding. I found myself nodding too, recognizing the pattern even though my own experience had included physical violence. The underlying dynamic was the same, the gradual erosion of self, the fear of making mistakes, the constant walking on eggshells. How did you know it was time to leave? I asked Diane, the question that had been haunting me since arriving at Grace's house. How did you finally decide? She smiled sadly. My daughter had a baby. A little girl. And one day, I was holding her, and I thought, what if she grows up to marry someone like her grandfather? What if she thinks that's normal, that's love? Her eyes filled with tears. I couldn't bear it. I couldn't be complicit in passing that legacy down another generation. Her words resonated deeply, though my own situation was different. Tom and I had never had children. My 3 miscarriages early in our marriage had been followed by years of unsuccessful fertility treatments before we finally gave up. At the time, I'd seen it as a tragedy. Now, I wondered if it had been a blessing in disguise. After the session, Rachel pulled me aside. How are you settling in? It's strange, I admitted. Peaceful, but strange. I keep expecting Tom to appear, to drag me home. She nodded in understanding. That's normal. Your brain is still in survival mode, it'll take time to recognize you're safe. She paused. Has he tried to contact you? I shook my head. My phone's been silent. I'm not sure if that's good or bad. Probably both, she said frankly. Have you thought about what you want to do next? Legal options, I mean. The question made my stomach churn. I don't know. A restraining order seems extreme. And divorce, I couldn't even finish the sentence. You don't have to decide anything right now, Rachel assured me. But I should warn you, most abusers don't just let go. At some point, Tom will likely try to find you. To convince you to come back. I knew she was right. The cycle was familiar: violence, apologies, reconciliation, a period of relative calm, then escalation again. I'd been through it countless times. But something felt different now. I had crossed a line by leaving, one that couldn't be uncrossed. I'm not going back, I said, surprised by the firmness in my voice. I don't know what's next, but it's not that. Rachel squeezed my arm gently. One day at a time, Susan. That's all anyone can ask of you right now. One day at a time. It became my mantra in the weeks that followed. I took a leave of absence from the clinic, using accumulated vacation time that Tom had never let me use before. I attended therapy sessions with the counselor who visited Grace's house twice a week. I started taking walks in the morning. Enjoying the simple freedom of moving through the world without fear. 3 weeks after I left, my phone rang with Tom's number. I stared at it, heart pounding, before declining the call. He immediately called back. And again. And again. Finally, I answered, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. Hello? Susie. His voice was soft, contrite. The voice he always used after an incident, when he was trying to win me back. Baby, where are you? I'd been out of my mind with worry. I'm safe, I said, echoing the note I'd left. That's all you need to know. Safe? What are you talking about? Of course you're safe, you're my wife. A pause, then, is this about what happened? I was drunk, Susie. You know I didn't mean it. The familiar excuses washed over me, and I felt myself wavering. It would be so easy to go back. To slip into the comfortable patterns of our life together, dysfunctional as they were. Tom, I said carefully, I'm not coming home. Not this time. Silence on the line. Then, his voice hardened. Who's been putting ideas in your head? Is it that pastor? I'll kill him. The threat sent a chill down my spine, reminding me exactly why I'd left. No one's putting ideas in my head. This is my decision. Bullshit. His voice was rising now. You don't make decisions like this. You've never had the spine for it. There it was, the contempt that always lurked beneath his professions of love. I closed my eyes, suddenly exhausted by the familiar dance. "Goodbye, Tom," I said quietly, and hung up. He called back immediately. I turned off my phone. That night, I dreamt of Tom again, not the angry, violent man he'd become, but the charming construction worker who had made me laugh in the ER all those years ago. In the dream, he was pleading with me to come home, tears streaming down his face, promising he would change. I woke with tears on my own cheeks, a deep ache in my chest. This was the hardest part, not escaping the violence, but letting go of the love that had once been real. The hope that somehow, someday, he would become again the man I had fallen for. After breakfast the next morning, Audrey found me sitting on the back porch, staring at the garden where Maria's twins were playing with bright plastic toys. "Rough night?" she asked, settling into the chair beside me. I nodded. Tom called. It brought everything back. She hummed in understanding. The first contact is always the hardest. "Did you respond?" I told him I wasn't coming back. She smiled, approval in her eyes. "Good for you. That takes courage." "Does it?" I sighed. Sometimes I wonder if staying didn't take more courage. Facing it day after day, year after year. "That's not courage, Susan," Audrey said gently. "That's endurance." "There's a difference." "What's the difference?" "Endurance is surviving. Courage is choosing to live." She gestured to the garden, where the twins were now squealing with delight as they chased butterflies. "Those babies? They're why their mama found her courage." "What's yours?" The question haunted me for days. What was my reason for finally leaving? Not children or grandchildren, like Diane. Not youth or beauty or talent waiting to be expressed. At 55, I was firmly in the second half of my life. What was I hoping to do with whatever time remained? I was contemplating this very question a week later when I walked into the communal kitchen and found Emma sitting at the table, talking quietly with Audrey. I froze in the doorway, a flood of emotions washing over me, betrayal, anger, but also a strange sense of relief at seeing a familiar face from my old life. Audrey noticed me first. "Susan, you have a visitor. I'll give you two some privacy." She slipped past me with a reassuring pat on my arm. Emma stood, her face pale and drawn. "Susie," she said softly. "I've been so worried." "How did you find me?" I asked, remaining in the doorway, unwilling to move closer. "Pastor David heard from his colleague in Westbrook that you were staying at Grace House." She twisted her hands nervously. "I've been calling hospitals, police stations. I was terrified something had happened to you." "Something did happen," I said flatly. "I left my abusive husband." She flinched at my bluntness. "I know. I should have helped you do it years ago. Instead, you slept with my pastor." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "I can't defend what I did, Susie. It was wrong. So wrong. But please believe me, it doesn't change how much I care about you. How worried I've been. I wanted to stay angry. Anger was safer than the complicated tangle of emotions her presence stirred up. But looking at her standing there, her face etched with genuine concern, I felt my resolve weakening. "Why are you here, Emma?" "To apologize. To see if you're okay." She hesitated. "And to warn you. Tom came to church on Sunday. He was not himself. He stood up in the middle of the service and accused Pastor David of stealing you away. Said he'd taken care of you for 30 years and now you were gone because of outside interference." My blood ran cold. What did he mean by that? I don't know. But afterward, he confronted David in the parking lot. Got in his face, said he knew about the affair. Emma's voice dropped to a whisper. He said he'd kill him if he didn't tell him where you were. Did David tell him? No. He doesn't know, Susie. None of us do. But Tom, he's unraveling. Sheriff Mitchell pulled him aside, told him to cool off. He's been drinking at O'Malley's every night, telling anyone who'll listen that you've been kidnapped by religious fanatics. Despite everything, I felt a pang of worry for Tom. This was the man I'd loved for 3 decades, now apparently falling apart without me. The caretaker in me wanted to rush back, to help him, to fix things. But the small, fragile part of me that was just beginning to heal recoiled at the thought. "Thank you for telling me," I said finally. I'll alert the staff here to be extra vigilant. Emma took a tentative step toward me. "Susie, I am so sorry. For everything. The affair, yes, but more than that, for not seeing how bad things were with Tom. For not helping you sooner." "You tried," I acknowledged, remembering the times she'd gently suggested I talk to someone, the women's shelter pamphlets she'd accidentally left in my bathroom. I wasn't ready to listen. And now? Now I'm learning to listen to myself. She nodded, understanding in her eyes. Can we talk sometime? Really talk? I miss my friend." I didn't answer immediately. The betrayal was still too fresh, the wound too raw. But standing there in the warm kitchen of Grace House, surrounded by the evidence of my own courage, I felt something shift inside me. "Maybe," I said finally. "Not yet, but maybe someday." It wasn't forgiveness, not quite. But it was a beginning. The call came at 2 a.m., jolting me from a fitful sleep. Rachel's voice on the other end was tense, urgent. "Susan, I need you to stay calm. Tom's been in an accident. He's at Millfield General." I sat up, fully awake now. "What kind of accident?" "Car crash. He was driving drunk, hit a tree on Route 16. She paused. "He's in surgery. It's serious." A strange numbness settled over me. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because despite everything, I thought you'd want to know." Her voice softened. "And because when they brought him in, your name was the only one he kept saying." I closed my eyes, a familiar guilt washing over me. This was my fault. If I hadn't left. "This is not your fault," Rachel said firmly, as if reading my thoughts. "Tom made his own choices. What do I do now?" I whispered. "Whatever feels right to you. If you want to go to the hospital, I can take you. If you want to stay away, that's valid too. There's no right answer here, Susan." After we hung up, I sat in the dark, wrestling with the decision. Part of me wanted to rush to Tom's side, the part that had spent 30 years caring for him, making excuses for him, loving him despite everything. But another part, the part that had finally found the courage to leave, recoiled at the thought of being pulled back into his orbit. In the end, I compromised. I asked Rachel to take me to the hospital, but not to see Tom. Instead, I spoke with his doctor, a young woman who clearly recognized me from my nursing days. "He's stable," she told me. "Fractured ribs, broken leg, internal bleeding that we've managed to control. He was lucky, the tree he hit probably saved his life by stopping him from going into the ravine." "Will he recover?" "Physically, yes. But his blood alcohol level was 3 times the legal limit. This isn't his first DUI, from what I understand." She gave me a searching look. "Are you here to take him home?" "No," I said firmly. "I'm not part of his life anymore." She nodded, seeming relieved. "Good. I'm sorry if that's presumptuous, but we've seen you in the ER. Too many times over the years, Mrs. Reynolds. The staff here, we notice patterns." I felt a flush of shame at the realization that my colleagues had known all along what was happening. That they had seen through my thin excuses and carefully constructed lies. "Thank you for taking care of him," I said, turning to leave. Mrs. Reynolds, the doctor called after me. For what it's worth, I'm glad you got out. I nodded, throat too tight to speak, and walked away. Rachel was waiting in the hospital chapel, a quiet space designed to accommodate all faiths. She looked up as I entered, question in her eyes. I didn't see him, I said, settling into the pew beside her. Just talked to his doctor. He'll recover. How do you feel about that? Relieved, I admitted. I never wanted him hurt. I just wanted space to breathe. She nodded in understanding. And now? I stared at the simple altar at the front of the chapel, adorned with symbols from various religions, a cross, a Star of David, a small Buddha. Symbols of faith, of hope, of resilience. Now I need to figure out who Susan Reynolds is without Tom defining her existence. Rachel smiled. I think you're already well on your way to finding out. The next few months passed in a blur of small steps and big decisions. I filed for divorce, a process made easier by the domestic violence documentation from the hospital and the support of a pro bono lawyer Rachel connected me with. Tom contested it at first, alternating between threats and pleas, but eventually, faced with the weight of evidence and his own precarious legal situation after the DUI, he reluctantly agreed. I found an apartment in Westbrook, small but sunny, with a balcony where I could grow herbs and flowers. I returned to work at the clinic, brushing off concerned questions with a simple "Tom and I are separating" that seemed to satisfy most of my colleagues. Rachel and I continued to meet regularly, not as chaplain and patient anymore, but as friends. She encouraged me to join a support group for survivors of domestic violence, where I found myself increasingly able to speak about my experiences without shame or fear. Slowly, painfully, I began to rebuild my life. To discover who I was without the constant shadow of Tom's moods and demands. It wasn't easy. 3 decades of conditioning don't disappear overnight. I still flinched at loud noises, still rehearsed excuses out of habit, still woke sometimes from nightmares where I was trapped in that house again. But there were good days too. Days when I felt lighter, freer. When I made decisions based solely on what I wanted, not on what would keep the peace. When I recognized my own strength in having survived, in having finally found the courage to leave. 6 months after moving into my new apartment, I received an unexpected visitor. Pastor David stood on my doorstep, Bible in hand, looking both older and humbler than I remembered. "Susan," he said softly. "May I come in?" I hesitated, then stepped aside. This conversation was long overdue. He sat awkwardly on my couch, placing his Bible on the coffee table. "I've come to apologize," he began. "What I did, with Emma, it was a betrayal of your trust, of my position, of everything I claimed to stand for." "Yes, it was," I agreed, settling into a chair across from him. "I have no excuse." He looked down at his hands. "I was trying to help you, to guide Tom toward a better path, and somewhere along the way, I lost sight of my own." "You hurt me," I said simply. "Both of you." "I know." He met my gaze, genuine remorse in his eyes. "I've stepped down from my position at the church. I'm in counseling. Trying to understand why I did what I did." "And Emma?" "She's struggling. Blames herself for not seeing the extent of Tom's abuse. For betraying you when you needed friends most." He paused. "She misses you." I nodded, unsurprised. Despite everything, I missed her too. 30 years of friendship isn't easily erased, even by betrayal. "I didn't come here to ask for forgiveness," David continued. "I don't deserve it. I came because I wanted you to know that Tom has been attending AA meetings. He reached out to me after his accident, not as a pastor, but as someone who had also hit rock bottom." This surprised me. Tom had always refused to acknowledge his drinking problem, even after the DUI, the bar fights, the countless nights of alcohol-fueled rage. Is he doing better?" I asked, unsure how I felt about the possibility. He's trying. One day at a time. David smiled slightly at the familiar recovery phrase. He wanted me to tell you that he's sorry. That he understands now why you left. It's a little late for that, I said, a trace of bitterness creeping into my voice. Yes, it is. David nodded. For what it's worth, I told him not to expect you to come back. That some damage can't be undone. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of years of complicated history between us. I don't know if I can forgive you, I finally said. Or Emma. Or Tom. But I'm learning that forgiveness isn't about excusing what happened or pretending it didn't hurt. It's about not letting it control my future. That's wisdom, David said quietly. More than I had, certainly. After he left, I sat for a long time on my balcony, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. The air was warm, fragrant with the basil and lavender I'd planted in colorful pots. In the distance, church bells rang, marking the hour. I thought about forgiveness, about healing, about the long road still ahead. About Tom, trying to piece his life back together without me. About Emma and David, grappling with the consequences of their actions. About Rachel, whose tragedy had transformed into a mission to help others. And I thought about myself, Susan Reynolds, no longer defined by being Tom's wife or by the secret shame of abuse. A woman still discovering who she was, who she could be. The future stretched before me, unknown and a little frightening, but also full of possibilities I'd never allowed myself to imagine before. There would be hard days ahead, certainly. Days when the past would threaten to overwhelm the present. When the habits of a lifetime would be difficult to break. But there would also be days of simple joy, of sunlight on my face without fear, of conversations without calculation, of decisions made freely and confidently. Days of living, not just surviving. As twilight deepened into night, I made a silent promise to myself, to honor this second chance by living fully, authentically. To face each day with the courage it had taken to walk out that door 6 months ago. One day at a time. I wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring. Perhaps more healing. Perhaps more challenges. Perhaps even, someday, true forgiveness, of others and of myself. But whatever came, I would face it as the woman I was now becoming. Susan Reynolds. Survivor. Nurse. Friend. And now, finally, the author of her own story. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to my channel for more content like this. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below.